just go sit down with you guys rather than being the wise person at the front of the podium, or not so wise. So thank you for attending this last session. I'm sure there will be people trickling in because there's delicious chocolate desserts out there, and who can resist that? And M&Ms, I saw that too. So part of the title of this last section is Call to Action. And I think we learned a lot today about lots of concepts and gaps that we try to fill within public-private partnerships. And I'd really like the panelists today to opine on, okay, all these great concepts and ideas that we talk about, and some of them we're already working on. What is the action plan and the implementation plan that we can actually take action on? We will introduce some new concepts as well, but first let me introduce our panelists, or actually I'll let them introduce themselves. So we'll start right here with Susan.
All right, well, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Winckler, and I serve as CEO of the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. We usually joke that if you've not ever heard those 7 words in that order, that's typical. So we are a foundation that was created by Congress in 2007 to be a support to the Food and Drug Administration to help connect the FDA to the outside world to learn about things, much like what is happening today. And so happy to be here and to talk about what it is that PPPs can do in this space.
Wonderful, thank you. Avi.
Great. I'm Avi Kulshreshtha. I serve as the Executive Director for the Maryland Innovation Initiative. We are a quasi-state agency, a public-private partnership that focuses on funding innovative and translational research that not only solves grand challenges, but also supports the broader economic development and commercialization ecosystem in the state. My perspective and most of my work has been at the state policy level. I'm a scientist by training, but have really focused on the intersection between state policy and economic development.
Great, thank you. Last but not least, Martijn.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Martijn Müller. I'm the Senior Scientific Director for the Critical Path for Parkinson's. I have that been since 2021, and before that I was in academia where I was Associate Professor of Radiology at the University of Michigan for 15 years, University of Pittsburgh before that. So my expertise is in Parkinson's, and you already heard a lot about Parkinson's today, and I'll keep tagging on to that as a bit of a case example.
Actually, why don't we jump in and do exactly that? So, we'll start with you. I know you've been involved in some of the biomarkers in the Parkinson's space. We talked about some of that today already earlier, but I'd like you to kind of build on some of the sessions that we had earlier about, what does it even mean to intervene early? What do biomarkers need to function as in this space? So would you share some of your experiences with that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, if you start talking about intervening early, that's really, really difficult, because how are you going to intervene early for something that there are no symptoms yet or no signs of the disease yet, right? So for a lot of diseases, that will be quite difficult to accomplish. Parkinson's is actually a case example where there is this opportunity to start intervening early. So as Dr. Tanner very nicely showed, even in different graphics, the disease, starts manifesting with, these things like REM sleep behavior disorder, so acting out of dreams, loss of sense of smell. Maybe subtle changes in speech can be observed if you start thinking about using digital health technologies, or subtle changes in reduction of arm swings. So when these things start occurring, you can start thinking about, might Parkinson's disease, be developing in somebody. But you're still not quite sure. So this is where really you can start looking at biomarkers. As Dr. Tanner also explained, alpha-synuclein and the misfolding of alpha-synuclein is really the key pathological hallmark of the disease. So for the longest time, there was no good biomarker for that, and thanks to initiatives that were sponsored by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Dr. Tanner also referred to that, the PPMI study, A lot of natural data was collected on that, CSF data, blood plasma data, et cetera, et cetera. And once those techniques became available, you can, and not only you can, they did start detecting and analyzing alpha-synuclein in these markers. So that then provides the opportunity to create a biomarker that can be used for early detection of disease. So once you have that, right, so you have this constellation of these early symptoms, these minor, changes that you're seeing. Also, I refer to ones that are quite specific to the disease, but there's also non-specific symptoms, anxiety, depression, constipation, those are all things that might start occurring as well. So with this constellation, you can start thinking about, about early intervention. You can start thinking about, is somebody really developing Parkinson's disease? So, so that provides you then a good opportunity, good window for your early intervention trials. But, and I think we'll get to that later on as well. There's many challenges to that. And what you do in early, this what used to be called prodromal Parkinson's disease is of course different than when you start intervening or start coming up with challenges when somebody has just been diagnosed with the disease. The symptoms are different. Things like tremor start showing up, slowness of movement, postural changes, et cetera, et cetera. And, what occurs in early disease after diagnosis is different than what occurs in, the more moderate stages of disease. And it's again different from what occurs in the very late stages of disease. So having a framework or a staging scheme around that sort of, where you understand the biology, the normal functioning biology, but also start to understand the pathophysiology of the disease, right, will be very good from a drug development perspective as well, because it really can guide you as to getting the right people, recognizing the right people, and getting the right people in your clinical trial, and having a framework that will allow you to design the right endpoints for each of these different stages of disease. And so this is something where the Critical Path Institute and Critical Path for Parkinson's, together with our friends at the Fox Foundation, have been involved in developing actually this whole impetus for the framework in Parkinson's disease actually came from a few years ago. CPAT back then organized a neuroscience meeting where back then Dr. Dunn laid out the vision for the development of such a framework. We'll talk, I think, about biomarkers later on, so I'll hand it over.
Well, maybe a quick follow-up. I think one of the, again, the title here is what's the future of the public-private partnership. So can you speak a little bit more to the role of why it was important that a public-private partnership help put together this framework rather than an individual company or an individual nonprofit? Why did everybody need to come together? What was your experience?
So you gave the answer. Everybody needs to come together.
Yeah.
And I think that point, came across a couple of times this morning as well, because if industry does it by their own, then you have, maybe an industry-specific framework, and that, might be driven by individual programs, for example, right? So that is not helpful. So you need the input from the people in academia that can provide this basic knowledge, this, the basic science to things. You need the input from the regulators as to how they want to see the framework. You need the input from industry, because in the end they will, be leveraging this as well. And most importantly, and that has been repeated over and over again, you do need the input from patients as well, because Martin Müller, can decide for the patient what is important, but that doesn't mean that the patient will think it is important. So, bringing it together gives you the best product, so to say, the best tool.
Okay. getting everybody in the room. And Abby, that ties into what we want to talk about with you. We talked a little bit about the missing voices today and yesterday, about the type of stakeholders that are maybe not at this meeting. And we talked about payers. What we also didn't talk about was state organizations and states in general. So with your state hat on, can you kind of speak to that? Because I think most people in the audience are not thinking about states at all. So enlighten them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think states can be, I think, unlikely first ports of call when you think about these public-private partnerships, especially in the space of early disease interception. But there are a few things that I think actually position states really well to be partners in this. And I'll talk about some concrete examples. First, states sit on unique assets in some ways. So one part of that is just funding. Cumulative federal funds toward research and development in healthcare, at least in 2023, were about $50 billion. The cumulative state spend toward healthcare in 2023 was $1.3 billion. So for those keeping track, it's about 3% of the total federal figure. But $1.3 billion is still a pretty substantial figure. States are investing a lot of money, and in fact, more of that funding tends to go toward applied or translational research than does the federal share. So states are investing in this space. The other asset that states sit on is data. And so, a lot of states, every state has a Department of Health. States all operate their own health information exchanges that have varying levels of quality. States sit on really unique social determinant of health data that come from Family and Social Services Administrations, Departments of Health. Sometimes states even operate the ambulance services, and those come with really interesting targeted sources of data as well. So that's where states are positioned. That's why states are sort of uniquely positioned in terms of assets. States are also uniquely vulnerable. And there are a couple ways that that's seen. I think we can talk about the broader social cost of not intercepting diseases early, but that feels like a very abstract figure. And in fact, there are very concrete costs that are borne by many people across the healthcare value chain when we don't intercept disease early. And some of the people who bear those costs, again, are states when they operate Medicaid. Mm-hmm. States are a substantial portion of Medicaid spend and an increasingly substantial portion of Medicaid spend as of this year. And nonprofit public healthcare systems. So in Alabama, where Maaike and I got to live for a little bit, UAB Hospital is the third largest public hospital in the United States, writes off almost $100 million per year in bad medical debt. So that's mostly from Alabama's nationally leading, sounds like the wrong word, uninsured population.
Lagging
Yes,
maybe?
Yes, lagging insured population. So states are uniquely vulnerable and I think motivated to act on that. And then the third thing that I'll say is, I think states, I forget who it was, are referred to as laboratories of democracy. They're also laboratories of innovation. There are 50 states and 50 different ways that you can build public-private partnerships because states, by and large, wield sharper tools than does the federal government. And so states, a fund like the Maryland Innovation Initiative Fund, which is contemplated as a public-private partnership, we make grants, we make investments, we bring universities and industry together. I have a hard time contemplating what that would look like at the federal level. Not to say that we don't work very closely with federal counterparts, but it's a very unique institution, and a lot of states have set up similar things. So maybe I'll just cap off by talking about a couple of ways that I think states have actually started to lead in this space, and where I really hope federal stakeholders and others learn from some state models. And one is in Indiana. And so Indiana has a number of assets that lend the state toward a public-private partnership in early disease interception. One is its substantial industry base, and Lilly is based in Indiana. That's probably enough by itself, but many pharma companies have at least a substantial R&D, if not manufacturing base in the state of Indiana. Second is its health information exchange, which happens to be one of the most detailed and longitudinal in the United States. And then third is its research prowess. It's home to 3 R1 research universities who all do great work in healthcare and public health. And so what Indiana was able to structure through a public-private partnership is a program called Analytics IN, or Analytics Indiana, which is essentially working between the universities, Lilly, and the state's healthcare providers to aggregate detailed patient-level data using their health information exchange and social determinants that are already being aggregated by the state government, and work with pharmaceutical partners like Lilly, and right now they're focusing on type 1 diabetes, to not only think about early diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, particularly in communities that are prone to being missed when we think about early type 1 diabetes diagnostics, but also to think about therapeutics, which is, of course, where Lilly's part comes in. Lilly's doing large-scale analysis of over 30,000 genomes, and they're expanding to 100,000 genomes by the end of this year, or by the end of next year, to identify some of these genetic markers associated to type 1 diabetes and work with the state government to think about targeted interventions, again, particularly in areas of the state that have been left behind. The other unique example that I'll mention is a program that the state of Alabama put $20 million into last year, which is a program called the Catalyst Program, focused on collecting what I think all of us are familiar with, the All of Us program. This is almost think of it as a complement to that program that'll focus on Alabama's rural and underserved populations that are oftentimes missed by federal programs because, again, states know their populations better than the federal government does. Collecting patient samples and genomes from throughout the state, and working with public health researchers to, again, identify and intervene based on validated polygenic risk scores. And so, again, when you think about the milieu of common disease in the state of Alabama and all of the polygenic markers there, it's not only an important population for us to understand, but a really important population for us to work with and address. And I could get into, I think, all the ways that I think states also are uniquely positioned to build trust with populations as well, but maybe I'll stop there.
Great, Abby, thank you. And then Susan, let's zoom out. So
Okay.
we're states, now let's go to the world. So we've had some participants and panels from the FDA, from the EMA, everybody saying we should harmonize things. But how can we practically actually start doing some of those harmonization exercises? And what should have been your experience there?
So when I think about the role of public-private partnerships in that, it's about stimulating the collective learning, right? Like providing the environment to have that collective learning. So I'll reflect, there was a meeting just about a year ago where global regulators came together with researchers, patients, and product developers to talk about the next generation of gene therapy. And what was really striking about that is that you had, from the FDA and the EMA perspective, they're actively reviewing gene therapies, talking about this, but then it was also the regulator from South Africa talking about how they just were in a very different place in what they might do, in part because the current gene therapies are simply not deployable in some of those environments. But the next generation of gene therapies may be, and so I guess it's an early interception there, in that you have regulators thinking about what they might see and how they can learn from what others have done and have that shared learning environment. But it was fascinating to watch the researchers learn from each other, and from the industry speaking about how they were developing it, and then regulators, their various perspectives. And that shared learning creates an environment where we can embrace our curiosity, but then also have some of that comfort level to think about things differently. It creates a safe space to say, perhaps we can advance this by doing something in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thank you. And I think somebody mentioned on a panel earlier, it was about we need to start maybe developing some of these regulations together before they're needed.
Yes.
Rather than we develop some, you develop some, 5 different groups develop some, and now let's try to harmonize them. Do you have any practical ideas? I'm putting you on the spot, but let's fix the problem right here on stage.
Right. Well, it actually came up in that very conversation of saying, okay, should we really, for it happened to be gene therapy, but I think we could think about this in other rare disease where you have an intervention. Do you really need to complete the evaluation, or do you need to do the evaluation in every single regulatory environment? Or do you up front think about what will be common across all of these regulatory environments, which there will be something, if it's the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, or some other dynamic that can have that common approach, and then allow the regulatory spaces to say, okay, and then here's where we would diverge and do our own work. So it's that, I think, looking to the future and saying, where do we have a common element that might be well served, and where then can an individual organization say, and here's where we would need to diverge and evaluate it.
Because of legislative reasons?
Correct. Or different infrastructure of the health system, all of those dynamics.
Yeah, great. I think one of those new areas that we talked about a little bit is the NAMs, the novel approaches to methodologies, or whatever preferred acronym.
Non-animal methods. The NAM works really well.
Let's just go with NAMs, yes. So within CPATH, we have some efforts around this, but I know, Avi, you have been active in this space a little bit, I think actually from a state perspective. So can you maybe give us an example on what Maryland is doing in the NAM space, or what other examples you may have, and think about, can we engage the regulators early across the globe to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've, Maaike and I and a lot of folks on the CPATH team have gotten to talk about NAMs for a while. Not only from, I think, the scientific and regulatory perspective, but again, from the perspective of how do we see this as an economic development opportunity in and of itself? I think, I know there was a panel on this yesterday. I think NAMs are positioned to pretty substantially change the financing pathway when you think about drug discovery and drug development. Of course, there's, depending on who you want to believe, anywhere from $10 to $20 million or more of work to be done in the preclinical space that is really, bears out in high risk. It's sort of exacerbated by the high risk that it generates across the clinical development pathway. And so one thing that I've been working on with CPATH and others in the state of Maryland is really trying to think about how we position the state as a sort of testing bed and an epicenter for non-animal models or alternative methodologies. And that looks like a couple of things. One is really, again, I think as Susan mentioned, there's an element of bringing folks together to identify what our motivators are. So again, from the FDA happens to be in Maryland, which is a great boon to Maryland. So bring the FDA to the table to understand, what is the agency looking at, and how can states, public-private partnerships best support those outcomes. The state of Maryland right now is singularly focused on economic growth, especially given federal workforce cuts that affect Maryland more acutely than other states. And so the state is trying to think about this from the perspective of how do we reinvigorate a life sciences cluster that is strong in some senses, but hasn't really changed all that much over the last 20 years. And universities, of course, beyond just looking for funding right now, given the current federal funding landscape, are looking for opportunities to engage with industry and regulators to actually solve critical challenges. And so what that's come to in Maryland is a sort of burgeoning partnership where our goal is to work between the Center for Animal Alternative Modeling at Johns Hopkins, the FDA, of course, and our sort of investor and business base in the state of Maryland to really say, this is the place where you can get the business support, the regulatory expertise, the scientific know-how to launch and advance your non-animal model. And that includes not only developing the model itself, but also taking it through the regulatory paces that make it a more relevant model in the drug discovery and drug development world.
And if I could build on that, actually, Tina Morrison, who was with the FDA at the time, sponsored a project with the foundation to talk about non-animal models. And when we went into it, having kind of the regulatory lens, we're like, surely what industry needs is more guidance about when these are appropriate. And what was really interesting in the shared learning is that the industry came, in the course of these conversations said, no, we need help convincing our C-suite that this is okay. Mm-hmm. We need to de-risk it within the corporate culture. So the output of that collaboration was not a new guidance. It was a paper that then the folks who wanted to move in a different direction within their company could say, look, it's okay. It's okay to do this. And in fact, it's a good idea. But it was that wasn't our thought going in.
Yeah, and actually Ralph Harold from the EMA this morning mentioned it in one of the sessions. I actually wrote it down. Regulations and regulators can help with valorization of technology. And that's something that's probably not on everybody's radar immediately. So again, something where public-private partnerships and having those conversations can make a difference there.
I think that's entirely right. Because, you know, at the end of the day, I think these scientific and regulatory advances are critical, but in order to be sustained and in order to grow, they need to make business sense to somebody. And oftentimes, you know, as I think has been the case with non-animal models really until the last couple of years, it has seemed like a risky proposition.
Because we've always done something else.
Right. And so public-private part, you know, I think this one that we're working on is far from the first. I know there have been a lot of efforts that CPATH has led in the space, but I think this sort of continual process of convincing industry that this is the right thing to do, providing capital and again, know-how, I think critically as to how to engage in that space. I think that's a really unique role that public-private partnerships address.
And a question we haven't prepped, but Martijn, do you know if NAMs can help with biomarker identification and you know, qualification, whatever word you want to use there?
I'll hand that to Klaus.
We can
I
talk
don't
about
have the
it
right
in
answer to that.
Still, we do want a transition. Oh, Klaus, you want to give a 2 second?
I'll use this one. So the answer is absolutely yes, because what was the original set of first qualifications ever of biomarkers for drug development? It was a panel of 7 safety biomarkers for translation. That's what it was. And it started informing a lot of things that have now changed in the way the whole industry looks at kidney safety. Okay, so just put it more technology that reflects more the human in the equation, not the animals in the equation, but the humans in the equation, and you can help identify some additional technologies and some additional tools that can be used for many different context of use statements. But I'll get back to you, Martin.
We're going to have some follow-up conversations about this. Well, speaking of technologies, and Martijn, I know within CPP there's also been an interest in DHTs. And can you kind of speak to how those technologies, DHTs, AI, NAMs, et cetera, are informing the development of new biomarkers that ultimately allow us to intervene early?
Okay, so I'm back on.
Yeah, back on track. Sorry.
So, yeah, so indeed. So I would say within the last 10, 15 years or so, of course, DHTs became quite hot. Digital health technologies, technology got cheaper, technology got smaller, and you know, now we're all at a stage where almost everybody has some kind of digital health technology around their wrist or around their fingers or something like that. Which allows for the continuous monitoring of movement, which allows for the monitoring of sleep. If you start combining it with, you know, your phone, you can start putting data into it. You know, you can even do, you know, mood assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, that sets you up for collection of a lot of data, and that is data that indeed can be used in clinical trials. You know, one of the big advantages being, again, to the case example of Parkinson's disease, you know, with Parkinson's disease, it was highlighted this morning as well, it's very heterogeneous. You know, your assessment depends you know, on time of the day. Is it early in the morning? Did you sleep well the night before? Did you get your cup of coffee in or not? Et cetera, et cetera. So the variability, you know, menstrual cycle was discussed this morning, actually plays a role in it as well for assessment. So All of that, makes it a highly variable measure, and digital health technologies allow for the continuous measurement over time. So you're sort of trying to get a better estimate of and a better capture of functioning. So it all sounds very ideal, of course, but here come the disadvantages. So as I mentioned, technology has become cheaper, and there's plentiful of technology. So there is maybe, 10 different, things that you can wear around your wrist. There are, I lost count, but so many different platforms that, you can use with your phone where you can do monitoring of data. And then on top of it, to make it even more complicated, so these are all accelerometers that you have on your wrist and your gyroscope. There's digital signals, and with digital signals, it's very easy, and this is what I did in my own academic career, to create 100 variables or something like that, just for one assessment, just for walking. So here you have the problem, different technologies, different platforms, and you can create easily thousands of variables. So here you have a problem, because what are you going to use in your clinical trial?
Yeah.
And how can you have confidence in what you're using for your clinical trial? There is the confidence of the technology itself, right? Are you really measuring tremor? Or are you measuring somebody brushing their teeth, for example, right? So these are things that you need to solve. Are you really measuring gait? So you need to do a lot of these kind of validation studies. You need to start, comparing these platforms to each other, right? Are they all telling the same story? And then you sort of need to reduce it down to, what will become your concept of interest, right? What are you going to look at? That becomes very complicated in itself as well. Again, it goes back to the disease being very heterogeneous. So if that is an issue for your traditional clinical outcome assessment, it's also an issue for your digital outcome assessment. Is it going to be gait that you're going to look at? Is it going to be tremor that you're going to look at? Measures of bradykinesia, slowness of movement that you're going to be looking at. So there is. So I've sort of laid out all the challenges. Are you going to expect from me? Well, we have the answer. I don't have the full answer just yet. But that's exactly the reason why we need public-private partnerships. That's why we need need organizations like the Critical Path Institute. And I want to give the case example of what we did in Critical Path for Parkinson's, where we had a study, an exemplar study, which was initiated at the University of Rochester by neurologist Ray Dorsey and sponsored by industry partners, Biogen and Takeda. It was called the WATCH-PD study. Okay. And that study was used as an exemplar study with the consortium for regulatory interactions and to learn together on how to leverage digital health technologies. We learned together by making the data that came out of that study available to all of the members. Not at the end of the study, not after there was some readout of, it was a natural history study, but no, when it became available, every 3 months there was a data cut available, like here's the data of what we have collected in the last 3 months. And so that's how everybody starts working on it, how everybody starts learning on it. You get back to the group, you give the feedback to each other, you share the data with each other, you start interacting with the regulators. Early and often, we went to the FDA and the EMA even before the study had started to get feedback on the protocol, which was tremendously helpful because, it changed our protocol. We got feedback during the study, which was tremendously helpful because we started integrating qualitative studies. And so this is how you, as a public-private partnership and, collaboration among all parties, learn and, move forward on the road of digitals.
Great. Shared learning again. going
Shared
back to
learning,
what
that's
Susan
the
was
important
talking
part,
about.
yes.
And let's transition a little bit from learning amongst drug developers to teaching potential stakeholders that need to have this information, patients, caregivers, physicians. Susan, what do you think the role of PPPs can be in that space to have this collection of organizations coming together to come together with this content?
So I think it's, I might say it's shared learning there as well, in that the teaching goes both ways, right? In that the clinicians and the patients have so much important information for regulators and developers and others in the ecosystem, the creators of the digital health tools that may or may not be helpful, depending on the environment. And the PPP provides a safe space not only for that common learning, but also what's really important in scientific exploration is that constructive debate, to bring together the sides that do not agree, that say, there's one way out of the room and it's that way, and from that chair you say there's one way out of the room and it's that way. If not brought together to have a conversation about it and change the view, we won't make much progress. So I think we should consider it an opportunity for everyone involved to learn from another participant within that public-private partnership.
I think there's something really critical there, and I think this goes back to, Martijn, what you were mentioning about data sharing. The creation of a public-private partnership itself requires a high level of trust between the folks who are part of that partnership, and I think that trust not only serves the people who are in that partnership, but I think to that point the people who are outside of it as well. And so, especially when you think about what is probably, and I don't think that they're a group that haven't been mentioned today by any means, but patient engagement especially. As a critical component of early interception of diseases. Again, you don't really have to go back that far to identify case studies where unilateral action that was not taken in partnership did things that were very detrimental for patients. And again, a lot of our work in Alabama was in the community of Tuskegee, where people will correct you if you say Tuskegee trial. It was the U.S. Public Health Service trial on Black men in Tuskegee. And so, I mean, that's a really critical distinction because there have been myriad things that have happened since then to ensure that patients are not put in that same situation. So it's not to say that we're at risk of that happening again. But, in a lot of ways that was seen as, in some ways, unilateral action, even though I think there's a lot more nuance to that story. I think there's this element of trust building, whether it's data sharing among organizations in a public-private partnership, whether it's mutual learning and communication. I think there's an element of that not only serves the people who are in that partnership, but the people who we are ultimately trying to serve. And so I think that's been, I think when you have to explain your motivations to other people out in the open, there's a little bit of, especially right now where there is a lot of distrust around, what are people's motivations for creating medicine and bringing it to patients? I think the practice of having to be open and transparent about your motivations itself supports even just the process of early disease interception.
As well as understanding, from the patient and clinicians, how are these products actually used?
Yeah.
Because there's the label, and then there's what happens, and we have, great opportunity to learn from that if we provide an environment where we welcome the input and will listen to it.
Yeah, and that ties into how do we create new medicine that ultimately, or even new frameworks that become adopted into policy. That's so I think there's two parallel streams there, almost like the adoption of new medicine, but then also adoption of new frameworks like biomarker qualification and so on. Have you had experience in that last step that will ultimately decide the success of a program or a product?
To see the policy. So actually, yes, and it was based it was a conversation about the use of, so this is a policy, but it's at a product-specific level. Yep. But it was a policy speaking to the use of a product for as medication to treat opioid use disorder. And the interpretation of the labeling writ large was that it wouldn't be effective in certain use of certain opioids. But when we brought together the clinicians and the individuals who used it and the payers who were limiting coverage because of the label and the clinicians who were limiting use because of the label, but they could hear from others about the how actually you could use it and you could use it safely, that led to a policy move by the agency to say, here's what the labeling could look like.
Okay.
And then the company said, okay. But they didn't have to. But it was that learning environment and saying, okay, there's a problem where this could be used better, and it appears that the label is a way to deliver that. So that's a micro example, but there are other examples where if you illuminate the challenges, you create an opportunity to have the policy solutions developed.
Great. We have almost 10 minutes, a little bit over left, so I want to give some opportunity for the audience to ask questions. While people are making their way to the mic or thinking of a question, just an open-ended question to any of you. How do we really see this future of PPPs? How can we avoid reinventing the wheel? How can we connect all those different PPPs that are in here to make like a macro PPP, meta, whatever you want to call it? And what are maybe some new innovative ways in which we can make sure that these are a success? Open podium here. Who would like to go first?
So I'll jump on it because I think there is so much to be done that I think it's really helpful when we talk amongst ourselves and say, okay, so you've got that, I'll take this, we need you to step in here, and here's where we can pull all of those efforts together. Those conversations, as you know, they really do happen.
Yeah, that reflects, again, wrote a note, somebody, I forgot who, said it's critical to have central, agile leadership and clarity in what success is. It sounds like that's resonating with what you were saying. How about you, Martijn?
Yeah, so I think, to create one, Uber PPP or whatever you want to call it, but sounds ideal. But I think what we, to get there, or where you can make at least a first step, is learning from each other, right? And so I've been talking about Parkinson's the entire time, but there was in the previous session a whole discussion about surrogate endpoints and about tau imaging in the Alzheimer's field. Well, we don't have tau. Tau is not of a huge issue within Parkinson's disease. Neither is amyloid. Not discounting it, but they're big, of course, in the field of Alzheimer's disease. In our field, it's alpha-synuclein. We're still waiting for a tracer to come. I'm very optimistic that maybe within the next 5 years or so, we'll have an alpha-synuclein tracer. And then we're exactly where our Alzheimer's friends were, right? And so that's when we need to start, not reinventing the wheel and say, well, let's, start from the beginning, but look at, what was their story? How did they approach it? How did they harmonize the data? How did they put together the evidence, et cetera, et cetera. So looking at each other, learning from each other, I think whether that's within one organization or between organizations already will be very helpful.
Thank you. Albie, any last?
Maybe only brief thought there is I think program evaluation is critical, and being able to publish on that is critical. And so I think, and not only talking about the outcomes, but the mechanics of, how was this structured? A lot comes down to structure. A lot comes down to governance. So what were the things that worked? What were the things that didn't? I think there's, this is I think a tortured analog, but in the same way that we look, we're hungry for failed data, right? Negative data points. We also need to have negative data points when we talk about public-private partnerships. And I don't really know. I think it's really hard to talk about all the things that went wrong, especially when you've received funding from all sorts of people. But I don't necessarily have a solution there. But we probably just need to find a way to be more honest about the things that haven't worked. I think one specific example. This is not health related at all, but I've seen a lot of good writing on the Chips and Science Act, because in some ways that was a big public-private partnership. There are a lot of people who have published from the prior administration as well, who have published very honest retrospectives on things that went really well. In some ways it accomplished, there's been a lot of capital expenditures in semiconductor manufacturing in the US. There are also questions about how sustained that's going to be. Yep. And so I think I've read a lot of good reporting out of that. Hopefully there's some part of that model that we can take and build on.
Great, thank you. Question from the audience.
Hi, I'm Ron Bartek. I'm a rare disease patient advocate. And I just want to go back briefly to your conversation about the NAMs, the new approach methodologies, plus AI. And I would refer to, as you all know probably, the publication of the FDA framework about these NAMs back in April, in which the commissioner stated that within the next 3 to 5 years, we want to make animal studies and preclinical data collection the exception rather than the rule. My gosh, that's a high bar. And I wanted to mention too, as you probably know, that there's a second Maryland institution deeply involved in this. That's the National Institutes of Health, and especially its National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, that's been leading the charge on these human cell-based technology platforms for about 10 years. And they're developing such things as tissue chips that have been to space twice, and organoids and 3D bioprinting, and trying to integrate into these technology platforms human cells, human nerve tissue, and been closely collaborative with the FDA. I'll never forget conversations between Peter Marks and Joni Rutter and Chris Austin about, wow, how can we develop these human cell-based technology platforms that can replace and be much better than animal studies, more replicable of the human condition. Peter Marks's response was, we don't even need to make them better than animals. We need to make them at least as good as animals, and then look at how much more replicable they will be of the human condition. Just like your comments on how, public-private partnerships with the NIH as well as the FDA, and bringing both those institutions together might greatly advance the use of these NAMs, plus AI, both in the Dr. Bhattacharya's announcement of highly prioritizing these efforts at the NIH, along with Commissioner McCary at the FDA, how we can build public-private partnerships that involve both of those institutions.
Great, thank you, Ron. Abhi, you want to maybe respond to that one?
Sure.
You're my NAMS guy now.
No, I think it's a great point. One thing that I think, I think that the agencies themselves have done an increasingly good job of collaborating with one another. I think you mentioned the FDA and NIH. There's also NIST, right, which is doing a lot of work in standardization of these models. We actually, a couple months ago now, got to host a roundtable that brought together not only the federal agency stakeholders, but again, private sector stakeholders, folks who from either a startup or an established company perspective might be thinking about this, as well as folks who are thinking about economic development. And I think one of the opportunities is just, it creates more, it creates more mediums for people to get together and talk about what they're respectively doing. And so I think what we heard from the federal stakeholders, we had NIST, NIH, and FDA represented there, was that, I think they'd been talking to one another already, but the practice of hearing and reacting to, again, what rare disease groups were saying, what private industry was saying, actually helped them learn more about what they were doing, learn about what the gaps are, and better position themselves going forward. So I think, again, it really is just this process of getting to be open about, our intentions, what we're looking to accomplish, that I think can enhance, again, a lot of the already great interagency work going on.
Great, thank you.
So I'm coming from a neuroanatomist perspective with the non-animal model kind of, aspect here. So because a lot of the Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS work has been working in this space for quite some time, organoids, differentiated, like iPSCs, all that, we've had a real challenge in being able to replicate age-related phenomena, right? And so I think that part will always be, I mean, that's something where it takes so much money to do this that I really hope to see that there's financial investment to really be able to try to model that. Because I think all of us have been trying to do that. It's not that we haven't been trying, it's just that the animal context can give us this kind of cellular environment that's more likely to model the age-related kind of condition, right? And the other, so I just want to raise that as a challenge. The other is that, you know, in drug development and in testing, making sure it gets across the blood-brain barrier. You know, I know there's some blood-brain barrier models that you can use, but I feel like there still may need to be a little component, at least, of some kind of animal work in there. But there has to be. It's so expensive to do this work that I totally agree. We have to have a partnership with groups that are willing to invest in that, and also find the groups that have a lot of expertise already, and not be, again, like reinventing the wheel, because people have been putting so much work into it and know which protocols already don't work. To have like just little islands of people doing it again is not going to be worth it. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce that idea of teamwork as we move forward.
Yeah, teamwork makes the dream work.
Yep.
All
And
right.
sharing the failures,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. And then last question for today, Penny.
Thank you for a wonderful session. Penny Dax with AFTD. So I'm in some public-private partnerships, and I've talked to folks and others for years that they're frustrating. I'm going to say that bluntly, right? Because we all have so much hope for them. And then we end up getting in these settings, and I see the power, and I see them as the key solutions for a lot of critical things. And I see everyone thinking that they're going to solve every problem that every member has. And then they, you know, it takes time to get consensus across all of these different stakeholders. And then there's these issues of, well, it's expensive, and is it on time? And I would just love to hear some reflections for all of you about what makes public-private partnerships work, whether that's milestones, whether that's very clear protection against scope creep, so making sure expectations match delivery. I don't say this because I'm not a fan of them. I'm a huge fan of them. But I also see some that I think are at risk because I see this investment and then the investors get frustrated.
Yep.
And I think we all need to really, I'd love to hear your wisdom about what you found as helpful.
Great, thank you. That's a great question to end on. I'll start down the line and we'll come this way. I'll have here all your three.
So the secret sauce is actually what I said before. It's collaboration and willingness to share data. And if you get that, you can get things done. So I was talking about the alpha-synuclein, right, and the alpha-synuclein protein, and that we now have the methodologies. It's called the alpha-synuclein SAA, seed amplification assay, right? So when that technology was out there, right, and the publications were there, and the biological staging framework was there, right? Everybody came together and said, you know, we need to have confidence that we can use this in drug development, right? So what do? You share data, you share observational data, you share clinical data, you get the methodologies, you get the things on validation, right? You put that all in a briefing document, you send it to the FDA, and if you do everything well, and if everybody shares, and if everybody works on that, then within 3 months you have a letter of support for alpha-synuclein SAA as a risk biomarker for clinical trials. So it can go really, really fast and well, but it also requires a lot of willingness from all relevant stakeholders.
It kind of comes back to trust probably as well.
And it's trust there as well,
Abby
yeah.
mentioned earlier. Abby, any words of wisdom for Penny?
Yeah, well, very briefly, I think there are a couple things. One is I think it's also important to know where public-private partnerships aren't the right model. I think there's always like the go far, go fast. If you need to go fast, it probably doesn't make sense to try to convene all these folks together. And so, I think public-private partnerships are important where telegraphing intention is important, where you need to combine investment from a number of folks, and I think where you need widespread impact. If you're working on a very specific drug asset, maybe that's not the right analogy, then there are private markets for that that more or less work, and might make more sense to do that. The last thing is that I'll mention is I think that governance is critical. And I think making sure that things are set up correctly from the beginning to be realistic. I think we need to be incremental sometimes in our expectations rather than all-encompassing. But I think establishing governance that allows you to have clear objectives, clear accountability, I think is, and then just being honest with one another about where those things are being met.
Great, and then last, Susan.
Ruthless enforcement against scope creep. You have to say no. And you have to say, and be constantly looking at, well, yes, that's intriguing, might even be exciting, might even be really, really interesting. No. And you have to have governance that helps you that will back you on it, and you have to have the self-reflection to just say no, or it will crush your PPP.
Wise words. Very last comment from the audience.
I know you have a comment too. Oh, I do. I'm from Cedar. We've worked with PPPs since 2004, or maybe even earlier, since that initiative document that Janet Woodcock had. We had PPPs even before. I've been working with them over all of these years, and the two things that you guys mentioned, the scope creep, we've had failures. You can imagine the examples. We've had failures because the scope kept getting bigger and bigger, and it's so exciting to have open space for scientists to think. And they think and they vocalize and everyone runs to do things. Low-hanging fruit, clear deliverables, because you are trying to prove that this model works. If you do this, you're boiling the ocean. No boiling the ocean, clear low-hanging fruits, tangible outcomes to satisfy the so what and the use. If FDA or the regulators or whoever it is needs this tool for this purpose, don't develop everything else as well. Just give them this so and the world knows that, oh, this model works.
Wonderful.
I think that's very critical.
Great words to end on. So thank you for a great panel. We have some closing remarks from Klaus, I think. We probably need a little picture of our panel, so we'll do that while Klaus talks.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Be efficient. Okay, so Amita, you pointed out something that is really important, and so did Susan, but I'll take it one step further. It's also the ability to say no to the stuff that was originally seen as low-hanging fruit that isn't anymore. We have a lot of things that have become old news, but somehow we keep working on them. And that needs to stop. And so tomorrow this is a perfect setup because tomorrow we're going to talk about scaling. Scaling this to new actors that we need to bring into the ecosystem and the next step in the evolution of the public-private partnership model. Okay, thank you everybody.